Be honest, when was the last time you thought about your current business insurance policy? If your existing business insurance policy is renewing on autopilot each year without checking out Zensurance, you're probably spending more than you need. That's why you need to switch to low-cost coverage from Zensurance before your policy renews this year. Zensurance does all the heavy lifting to find a policy, covering only what you need, and policies start at only $19 per month. So if your policy is renewing soon, go to Zensurance.com and buy your policy online in just a few minutes. Zensurance, mind your business.
I'm Abby Sharp, and I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to dismantle diet culture. Yes, that insidious multi-billion-dollar business keeping us on a never-ending hamster wheel of hating our bodies, fearing food, and spending our hard-earned money on a seemingly impossible mission to live our best, or more accurately, thinnest lives. On my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be using my signature science and sass to debunk myths, call out the charlatans, and take down the endless barrage of BS bombarding us every day. Tune in each week as I'm joined by guests for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and science-backed information to help you leave diet culture behind for good. Listen on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A week ago today, one of the key organizers of the convoy protest back in 2022 had been found guilty of 5 of the 9 charges against him for his role in the demonstration that crippled the Capitol for 3 weeks and prompted the first ever invoking of the Federal Emergencies Act.
Police! The media are blocking us! They're physically constraining him! Police!
That was the scene outside the courthouse with supporters trying to block members of the media after Pat King was found guilty of mischief, counseling to commit mischief, counseling to obstruct police, and 2 counts of disobeying a court order. However, he's been found not guilty of 3 intimidation charges and an obstruction charge. In the 42-page ruling, the justice presiding over the case found there was overwhelming evidence of King's leadership role in the protest, with his own social media posts directing people to honk horns and hold the line being key factors towards his conviction. King stood outside the courthouse with his lawyer, Natasha Calvino. Here's a short collection of what she had to say.
We're obviously disappointed, but I think the good takeaway here is twofold. One, it was a very thoughtful and very reasoned decision by a very learned judge, and we look forward to dissecting it, reviewing it, and deciding at a later time what, if anything, we want to pursue at a later date. But right now we're focusing on the sentencing.
What sentence are you going to be?
We're going to be seeking a sentence of time served. I think that Mr. King has served sufficient time in custody, and that we're going to be asking for a period of probation to be followed. Most importantly, I really want to get Mr. King his voice back.
The Crown will be seeking a prison sentence, and King could go to jail for up to 10 years. But what does this ruling mean for the court cases for the other main convoy organizers? And will these cases be the end of this convoy chapter for our country? Or is it just the end of the beginning of the rise of alt-right movements, especially in the wake of the re-election of U.S. President Donald Trump? I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, we're digging into those questions with Dr. Carmen Celestini, who's a lecturer at the University of Waterloo and works on research around extremism, conspiracy theories, and politics in North America. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Carmen, we have this verdict now in the Pat King case, but there are a pair of other decisions that we're still waiting on, with Tamara Leach and Chris Barber co-accused and some of the other main organizers of the convoy. Do you see the King ruling as one that will give us any indication of what may happen with Leach and Barber? Or do you believe the cases are different enough that we can't really draw any conclusions here?
It's going to be difficult to compare them. When we look at what Pat King was doing, he was online constantly. He was doing live feeds on Facebook, and he was doing live feeds on Twitter at the time. And what he was saying was used as evidence against him. We saw Tamara actually using social media in a different way, more for fundraising, more for putting out ideas. I will say that the organizers and those who were following at the convoy had very different posts when you looked at Facebook or you looked at Twitter and compared it to things they were saying on Telegram, right? It was very different types of posts, but they weren't saying the same sort of things that Pat King was saying, really pushing that, honking until no one can sleep and being giddy about it. They weren't really engaging in that. So I don't know if it'll be exactly the same.
Okay, so that kind of makes it interesting as to where the justice may go with Leach and Barber as we await those verdicts. I guess I'll pull back a little bit here and ask you the question that I asked in the intro to all of this. With these court cases all coming to or approaching a conclusion, do you see this as the end of things with the convoy and the alt-right, or is this just one chapter done and the next one beginning?
Well, I think that there's a whole bunch of prongs to look at this. When we think about far-right engagement, especially with those who are engaged in the convoy, people who are believing in conspiracy theories and being a part of this, the far-right has made inroads with those individuals through social media connections, memes, conversations. So that is definitely going to be used in the future. It'll rise up in different ways. We could see it happening on online engagement. We could see it happening with populist candidates and politicians. We can see the impact happening there. For most of these people who are engaged in this, they felt disenfranchised from the government, and there was distrust and this perceived sense of injustice. That hasn't just disappeared because the convoys are no longer in place. We also have to consider the individuals who were arrested in Coutts, and they're now being portrayed as being political prisoners, not for the acts that they actually did. So we're seeing a little bit of martyrdom happening there as well that can inspire other people to do things. I think that the far right will definitely still have its place. We can see a lot of incumbents across the globe are not holding their positions with elections, and that is more populist leaders who are espousing some far-right ideas when it comes to LGBTQ communities. So that distrust and engagement that's happening is having an impact in greater ways than we would actually think. We think about terrorism possibly, or violence, but it's definitely affecting the fabric of society and politics across the globe.
I know there are people who only started to be a bit more aware of far-right movements through things like the COVID-19 pandemic, the protests against mandates, and the unrest in the U.S. during the first term of Donald Trump. But let's not kid ourselves. This has been around in Canada for a long time.
Absolutely. We do have a history of far-right organizations. The Proud Boys were started here. We have a lot of connections to white nationalist groups globally. Those people are apparent even during the convoys. They did have an encampment in Hull outside of Ottawa where they were engaging and coming over to the protests. So we know that this engagement has been around for decades, but now I think there's just a little bit more freedom for them to engage and say the things that they want to say. We're seeing a lot of moral panics happening, right, with the so-called criminal moral panic, the CRT moral panic, the idea of anti-immigration and conspiracy theories attached to that. It's easier for them to articulate their beliefs because it is now part of the mainstream. And it isn't something that's sort of verboten that we couldn't have said, before that, we would have dismissed somebody talking about Nazi ideas or racism or misogyny. But now it is part of the vernacular, especially online and online communities.
So how did that happen? Where did we see this turn where people felt validated to bring those frustrations or views forward publicly when before they may not have felt so comfortable doing so?
Well, part of it was COVID. Obviously, we were engaging only online, and our communities ended up being those online communities. But we've also seen a rise of sort of influencers who are part of this sort of right-wing sort of world online. We have the manosphere where men are engaging and talking about their own senses of injustice and their anger towards society and not having the inheritance that they thought they would have. We're also seeing that while we were in COVID, we saw these conspiracy theories rising up. And a lot of them are articulations of people's fears and people's sense of injustice. When you link that together with far right, things start getting nested together into a convergence where it puts religion, puts conspiracy theories, and far right ideas. When Donald Trump was first elected, a lot of mainstream media and legacy media interviewed those they dubbed the alt-right, sort of showing these very attractive men, well-dressed and well-articulate, talking about these ideas. And it became more and more mainstream as that was happening, as influencers online rose up. They're also on the radio, right? In America, they're on 24 hours a day, these talk jocks about far-right ideas. So it just became something that we all engaged with and that we became aware of.
More on the big story with Dr. Carmen Celestini, a researcher around extremism, conspiracy theories, and politics in North America, in just a moment.
small business owner. So you wish to be at one with your enterprise. First, you must attain inner peace of small business insurance. This is Zensurance.
If you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, or a contractor, peace of mind is just a click away at Zensurance.com, Canada's leading source for small business insurance. It's quick, easy, and affordable. Get an instant price today at Zensurance.com.
Carmen, where is that line between people just expressing their political views and ideology and being labeled far right or becoming some sort of public safety or national security risk?
Well, when we think about having a discussion about politics, you and I may hold very different opinions, and we can have that discussion, walk away, and take from it another point of view. When it comes to a point where you have a political opinion that harms someone else, where you create an enemy or an other, and you blame one group for whatever problems you perceive as being political, that can get people to become violent. It can get people to start exploiting hate. They can start being grouping together and, being malicious online or in person. We can see that with the drag brunches, right? We see groups from the left and groups from the right in America, both armed, coming together and fighting outside of these drag brunches, but we're not engaging with the voices of the people who are there in attendance or the people who are the performers, right? So whose voice is the loudest? When those voices get really, really loud and you really have hate and feel that that person or that group is threatening you, your family, or your nation, that's when it can start becoming violent.
And that's a good point, an example, because while many people focus on the far right, you can get this on the left side of the political spectrum as well.
Yes.
Let's start looking forward now. U.S. President Donald Trump's first term has been linked by some to the rise of far-right movements. But of course, there are others who have praised the changes to society and government that he's brought in. He'll be taking over the White House again in January. Do you see things being the same as his first term or being different?
I think that's really going to depend on his first 100 days in the administration. I think that, all of his denials about Project 2025, now he's, putting people into positions who are the makers of Project 2025. The ideas of deportations and detentions, that can embolden people who have racism behind them in the far right. If the American people react to that negatively and don't support these things happening, like marginalization, LGBTQ or women or people of color, then I think that might diminish some of the impact that it has if there's a backlash against that. If he doesn't actually do it, then I think then they will still feel emboldened because he is their voice, right? He's articulating many of their fears and concerns. I think the trickle down here could happen in Canada as well. I mean, we have groups that hold on to these ideas of Christian nationalism and far right and conspiracy theories. And we could have politicians who are populists that see what Donald Trump is doing, and if he's successful, may try to implement it here. That sort of same rage politics is part of that. So I think it's really dependent on if his nominations go through or if it's on a recess and he just puts them in, or what his actions are for the first 100 days.
What about Canada, though? Could we see the threat of far-right extremism grow?
Possibly. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that if the continued environment sort of supports these ideas and pushes this narrative of anti-immigration, anti-feminism, anti-LGBTQ, that they definitely have a stronghold. And so more individuals could become engaged with it, not necessarily thinking they're in the far right, but thinking that they're fighting for something politically that they believe in.
A lot of Canadians like to consider us different from the U.S., that we don't have the same problems, even though we have seen some awful crimes and challenges on our soil. Do you see us the same as the U.S. in this issue, or are we completely different?
It's a bit different here, but we do see these groups rising up. I think that when we look at what the definition of the far right is, that can encompass Christian nationalists. It can encompass people who are white nationalists. So I think that there is a lot of convergence with some of these ideas. So I don't know if it'll rise up as violent, but I think it'll become more powerful and more impactful in our politics and some of the policies that we may have in our own election next year.
Have Canadian law enforcement and security agencies been doing enough to address this and prepare for what comes next?
I think our agencies are responding to it. We've seen in the last few decades where they've been paying attention to these groups and monitoring them and seeing the language that's happening online and the things that are happening, people making declarations of violence or people engaging in this conversation of hate. We can see them being picked up and monitored and engaged with. I think the moment that we realize that terrorism isn't necessarily something that's always foreign, there is domestic terrorism, that really changed the conversation of looking at these far-right groups. I think that online is, there's a difference between, being anonymous on 4chan and saying something than being your own person and saying the same thing on X or on Blue Sky. So I think that they are monitoring and paying attention to those things. And I think they are also paying attention to what's happening in the States as well and what that impact could have here. So I think that we are safe, but we should not dismiss these individuals, their concerns and their perceived injustices, because that is where it'll probably harm us the most.
Carmen, thank you so much for your thoughts on all of this.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Carmen Celestini, who's a lecturer at the University of Ottawa and researcher of extremism, conspiracy theories, and politics in North America, talking about the convoy protest, court cases, and the future of the alt-right in North America. Just a reminder about a new great listening experience for you. You can listen anytime to the Big Story podcast on Seeker. That's Seekr. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney. Thanks for listening.